On this episode of the Physio Foundations podcast, I'm speaking with Associate Professor Kellyanne Bowles from the Department of Paramedicine at Monash University, and we're going to talk about the paramedic profession and how Kelly and her team train paramedics to be professionals and what we can learn from this rapidly growing and rapidly developing profession. Welcome back to the Physio Foundations podcast, where we talk about the knowledge and skills that provide the foundation of expert clinical practice. So on this episode, we're going to take a wider view at the physiotherapy profession by speaking to someone from another profession, someone I get to work closely with in my role at Monash University Physiotherapy and more widely in the university, and that is Associate Professor Kellyanne Bowles. So Kelly's the acting head of the Department of Paramedicine at Monash University. Kelly's the Director of Research of our School of Primary and Allied Healthcare. And you're probably thinking, well, okay, that's great, but why am I interested in talking to Kelly on the Physio Foundations podcast? And if you look up Kelly, and I've got some information in the show notes and you can do that, you'll see that Kelly has an exercise science, a biomechanics background, and works heavily in paramedics, education and research. So why do I want to talk to Kelly on this podcast? Well, the reason is because Kelly has a really interesting professional background, and she's applied her foundational training in exercise science and biomechanics in a range of health and medical settings. And then she's worked with a lot of different people, a whole bunch of different types, professions and fields. And this brings with it a lot of interesting perspectives that I want to tap into today. And the key theme I want to tap into is the theme of the developing profession. The physiotherapy profession continues to develop, and the paramedics profession is rapidly evolving and developing, and Kelly's played a leading role in this development in research and education and clinical practice for a number of years at both the national and the international level. So that's why I want to bring Kelly on. So without further ado, Kellyanne Bowles, welcome to Physio Foundations.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me.
And I was saying before we press record, look, sometimes you have a topic and you say, well, I have to get a guest to talk to this topic. And sometimes you have a person and I really have to speak to this person. And there's 50 things we can speak about and we'll come up with a topic. And I think the topic's good. I'm looking forward to diving into it. But how are you, first of all?
I'm very well, thanks. Getting back into it. Semester starts next week, so it's always an interesting time.
How did you find time to talk to me? So you're Director of Paramedicine, Director of Research in our school, which covers multiple departments, teaching, supervising PhD students, other things you'll probably tell us about.
Yeah, there's a bit of time management. I think it's priorities. And I must admit, I think these sort of podcasts where have an opportunity to chat to someone, as you've sort of said, outside of maybe your professional area as well. I think it's always great to make sure you do prioritise that, to be fair.
Yeah. It's easy to say no to, but when you prioritize it, it is important to do. So, yeah. So thank you. So this is the 40th episode of Physio Foundations, and it's a really good opportunity to take a broader look at what I'm doing in the podcast, but more importantly, in the profession. And so the goals of the podcast are to explore the foundations of expertise, so yourself and other experts in professions and in the physio profession, but also the foundations that grads and students are building, and also of the profession itself. So, you've mentored me in my career. You're in an ideal position to sort of look externally at my career and give me some tips, but also to look at the physio profession as a whole. So I want to talk to you about your foundations, your background, and then we'll get into your perspectives of looking at our profession, and it should be fun.
Sounds good.
But before we go, let's introduce you and talk about your foundation. So I've missed plenty in my introduction there. I just sort of skimmed over the surface. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how your interesting career so far and where it's going and
for sure
where you're going? Yeah.
So I think when I suppose you can take it all the way back to when I was at school, I always wanted to be an elite sport biomechanist, and you would sort of see things. And look, to be fair, at that time in Australia, you probably didn't have too many people having that sort of role. But I was always fascinated what they were doing at the Australian Institute of Sport and had a huge passion for that. And so when I suppose I was probably quite pedantic. I looked at the best sort of human movement, as it was called then, course that I could do. which took me to Wollongong, which was a fantastic opportunity to sit at a beautiful beachside place as well as study at a fantastic university. And from there, we had a unit where, you had to engage in something outside of the university. So I was lucky enough to touch base with the people down the biomechanics department at the AIS and spent the semester there on a project, and then followed that up doing what they called at that time their postgraduate scholarship. And I really enjoyed it. And that was my absolute dream. I think when I was 15 years old to work in elite sports biomechanics. So to be able to do it was kind of nice.
Yeah, absolutely. So AIS, Australian Institute of Sport, and Wollongong on the east coast of beautiful place, east coast of Australia, for our overseas listeners. And so there's a story if you're doing undergraduate and you're slogging through some things and you're doubting yourself and what am I doing? My friends are having fun and I'm doing a 40-hour week here. That's something you were dreaming about doing since you were 15? Yeah? It wasn't something you just thought, oh, what am I going to do when I finish school? That was a pathway you'd set up.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's high level. So what was so fun and fulfilling about that? I mean, it sounds great, but specifically what's so good about that job working at that level?
It was the unpredictability, if I can be fair. You didn't know what was sort of coming in. And then even when I was at the AIS, you would work with, track and field athletes one day, the next day and I'm not sure if, your listeners have seen the great photos of that biomechanics lab in Canberra. It's very impressive. And we would literally be set up for athletics one day. You'd be set up for cycling the next day. We'd have everything in the pool. You'd be working with the swimmers. So it was incredibly unpredictable, which for me, and maybe not for everyone, that's what I really liked. You didn't know what you were doing from one day to the next, pretty much.
And Jodie had that same answer to the same question when she spoke about her. So Jodie Daykick a few episodes ago on the podcast spoke about working in elite sport and traveling the world. And certain personalities are suited to that, thriving with unpredictability, no doubt.
And if you don't need to sleep, then they're great people to work with.
Right.
That's what we did. World Championships for the swimming was an example in Perth a fair few years ago that, you need to work around the athletes' time. So they would do heats in the mornings, finals in the afternoon or evening. We would have to analyse all the races literally overnight, drop everything off so the coaches would have it the next morning so they have the information for the next heat. And we did that for pretty much 10 days straight. So running on about 4 hours sleep a night.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
And then the last night you'd have to put them together. And this weren't just for Australian coaches. We were doing it for international coaches too. So putting together all that information in a big booklet at the end. So they'd take that from that meet and be able to work with it. But yeah, it was a really exciting time. But then probably the other side of it for me is I maybe felt a little bit that it got to a point where it wasn't giving me everything also that I wanted. So it was great to work with the elite athletes, but I reckon I could do something that worked with more than just the elite athletes. And I thought it might have been a bit more fulfilling to sort of broaden my scope a little bit.
So that's sort of a key part of your story, isn't it, where you went? So what happened next? What did you do to help fulfill those other parts of your professional training?
Well, my PhD supervisor, and a few of your listeners might know of Julie Steele, just from everything that she's done in, knee injuries and things like that. She's an unbelievably internationally well-known biomechanist. And she's who I'd spent time with in my undergrad. I contacted her again and I sort of said, I think I need to do further training. I think I might look at a master's. And when I was at the Australian Institute of Sport, they did a small project then for Burley, who make sports bras. And it became really apparent that, people were not exercising because they didn't have very good breast support. And for me, that was thought, gosh, it's not about, necessarily winning the race. It's actually about being able to do something to keep people active, It doesn't have to be hightail stuff all the time. And so that's when I went back to Wollongong and followed my sort of postgraduate, both started as a master's and it went into a PhD and ended up, it was never the plan, I'll be honest. I don't know if most people are like that. That wasn't the plan. I was just going to do a master's, but was fortunate enough to get a scholarship and rolled into a PhD and then, ended up doing this whole PhD on sports bra design, which is quite different. And
you weren't expecting to do that, no doubt.
No.
When you were 15 or when you were in that role in high-end sports biomechanics.
No, not at all. But to me, we did different studies during the course of the PhD. It was about, can we just make this better so people can have an enjoyable quality of life and being able to go for a walk with friends, a run with friends, just quite different from that elite sport idea.
Again, another parallel with Jodie's other episode, so Jodie talked about her change from working with high and elite athletes and then realizing the simple solution, the very important, more public health solution of helping with physical activity in the women who are simply not exercising because of incontinence.
Yeah.
And, the same, there's a parallel there.
Very much so.
Missing out on physical activity and exercise because of bra fitting. So what did you solve with your research to help people?
Yeah, so we looked at sort of design stuff, mainly noting that, it comes and some solutions are pretty simple in a way that if you actually went and got fitted professionally for your bra, that's a big thing to start off with, because most of the things that females don't like about their bras were probably linked to the fact that the bra was poor fitting. We had great sensors, so we actually measured pressure under the bra strap. So a lot of people would sit there and go, well, that's a really uncomfortable thing when I'm trying to exercise. And we also had some people sit there and say, well, I don't want to wear a sports bra because they're too restrictive. And if I was doing exercise, I can't breathe in properly. So we did maximal and submaximal exercise testing with different ranges of bras and actually found out, again, if you were fitted, the sports bra actually made no difference to your lung capacity and things like that. So it was quite good in a way to look at the way that we sort of set some bras up. So we worked with Burley with that, and it was more about trying to get that education to get people fitted.
That better public knowledge and education. It's not just the data, but then you can feed that data back into the industry and say, well, you can quantify where the pressure is and that doesn't have an effect on breathing. And
that's right.
It's the hard yards behind the scene of that research and development. And this is academic research, isn't it? Feeding back into industry to say, well, this is what's needed, but we have data for that.
Yeah, I was fortunate. It was a good time, I think, when Australian funding really liked industry to work with universities, but they didn't put too much pressure on the industries to put a lot of money forward, because that's sort of maybe a little bit of the problem now, is that I think you get best research when you don't just do it in the university. If you go out and work with clinicians or you go out and work with companies and things like that, but that's really hard financially for everyone, to be fair. So it was at a bit better time for industry then to work with universities than what it is now, I think.
Right. Yeah, things change so quickly, don't they?
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And then paramedics. We've been talking about paramedics in the introduction, and the listeners are wondering, and then what happened next?
Yeah.
So now,
I suppose then, and I'm sure maybe some of your listeners at different stage, life also takes over. I had a family. We moved to be back closer to family because we then had children, juggling multiple roles. And I mean, this, like, you're trying to do everything at once. Probably took a bit of time out. It took me a very long time to do my PhD. I'm quite happy to admit that to people. I think people do a PhD and they feel like they're dragging the chain. Mine took me 10 years. I had 3 children during that time, which is probably not the smartest thing, but anyway. And so I did.
It's a very important thing.
Yeah, it is important.
Yeah. Let's not downplay that effort of getting a PhD done.
Yeah.
And starting a family. That's awesome. Yeah.
And so probably took a few opportunities and learnt maybe to think about the skills I had rather than a title that I had. And that's probably the most honest thing to say. I then realised I had some research skills. So, I went and worked at the Cancer Council for a year in their health behavioural unit and did a lot of statistics for a year, which was interesting. That took me to work at Melbourne Uni, and still, it was a recommendation from my PhD supervisor, and worked there on a project, a big project, for 4 years. And then, to be fair, when I finished my PhD, my husband said to me as a joke, "Does every person in Australia have your CV?" Because I felt like I did actually send my CV to everybody.
Right.
But, it's
why not?
Fortuitous, and you have to put yourself out there, And again, a fortuitous conversation with Terry Haynes, who's currently our head of school. And he had a vacancy he needed fill, and that was, I think now, nearly 9 years ago, which is unbelievable. And again, that's what I did for a while. So I worked with him, worked with lots of different health clinicians trying to get that research skills up when I was based through Monash Health. And then from there, when a position became available in paramedicine, it was using the skills I had. So that's skills in research education.
So you built your experience and your skills strategically. When you talk of your story and you reflect back on it, you can make a coherent story. There's sometimes just luck and change, and sometimes you get sick of things and you need more. But you have been fairly strategic in building up different skills in clinically and in research, in stats, and lots of career capital of knowing people, a lot of CVs sent out.
Yeah.
So there's a quick segue here or a quick side track here to, if we're thinking about young professionals who are in their jobs, and so there's some sort of advantage of working in different places, but there's some disadvantages of just getting bored and jumping ship. And there's probably an unfair generational typecast of the young professional or the young person who's just jumping from job to job and not happy and looking for fulfillment and needs to stay in things for longer. But I think that sometimes that's a bit unfair, because I look back on my career and what I did, and that's all added up really in a healthy way. And I moved around lots of different jobs. So how do you think we balance that when you're young and looking for opportunity and building yourself up?
I think it is about thinking about your skills. And I mean, my own kids are getting older now, are heading into university themselves and finishing sort of high school. And I think we get fixated on titles, and it's probably easy to say, you're a physio, you're a paramedic, you're this.
Right.
And yeah, that helps you get a job and it helps you define yourself. But I'm sure you could have 10 physios in a room and they all have very different skill sets. And it's about
definitely
really thinking about your individual skill set and not seeing it as a failure if you turn around and say, maybe that's not the path for me anymore. I've done my training, I've worked for a couple of years, I'm not really loving this anymore. But think about the parts of what you do that you love and what's the skill set that you think that you've got, and how can you adapt that into your next sort of professional step? Because I think that's the thing. We also sort of sit there and go, wow, I'm not an elite sports biomechanist anymore. And I don't think it's that I failed at it. It's just that I picked the bits of it that I liked and I worked out the skills I liked and I managed to put it into something else. And I think that's probably a good way to think about things.
Skills more than titles.
Yeah, I think so.
The title is the tool. It's really a reflection of the tool you used to get your training and your knowledge. And then there's so much career development you do through your work and building connections with people. And so skills.
Yes, and you think of physios must be some of the best communicators, really, to be able to have that ongoing relationship with patients and develop that. So if you sort of think about that, if that sort of pathway or you have a change, how great are your communication skills in that? How good are your time management? Because if you're working in clinics, you have to fit so much into the space of an appointment. These are all skills that you probably don't think that you have, that you probably have, that you can roll into the next thing.
Yeah, that has come up so many times in conversations on this podcast, that importance of not just learning robotically the things to say and the things to ask and the checklists, but how your personal development, your life feeds into your professional development, how you can hold a conversation with somebody and listen to them and not just get lost in your own head. So there's my segue. What do you think? So I ask all the guests that come on here, so it's mainly been physiotherapists. So I've been asking them, what are the most important knowledge and skills for a physiotherapist? What if we get away from knowledge and skills and ask you the same question just about the profession? What do you see as really, what are the attributes that make a really good physiotherapist? And that could be a clinician, but it could be more broad than, as you said, the title.
Yeah.
More about their skills and the person and they're building their career. What do you think makes somebody successful in that profession?
Oh, God, there's a couple of things. The real research nerd in me would start with, I think that it's actually really important that every clinician understands research, and it doesn't mean that you actually have to be the one to run all the trials and things like that. But, if you really want to give, if you're working clinically and you really want to give your patients the best clinical care, or if you're working in an academic setting and you want to make sure your students get the best academics and then the most up-to-date education, understanding research so that you can actually apply it. I think that is an invaluable skill. And then I think the way we're going in life, this ability to collaborate with other health professionals and have those relationships outside of, outside of your hospital, outside of your clinic, I think that is imperative. I can put the paramedicine hat on for a second. We are seeing huge changes in the profession in paramedicine, and community paramedics in Australia is something that we don't really have yet, but really I think in the next couple of years will change a lot. And that is all about collaborative care. It's all about conversations, including the patient in the conversation, so not leaving them out, but all those conversations that look at things coming from multiple angles. And so that, can the physio speak to the paramedic? Can they also speak to the OT and the speech therapist? And it's about that multidisciplinary collaborative teams. And that comes down to communication skills, comes down to seeing something from somebody else's point of view that you hadn't thought of, and I think that's a key to someone who's a great clinician.
Life experience plays such a big role in that. But it's not to say that if you're a student or you've just graduated that you don't have an enormous amount of those skills within you that you need to tap into, and that's where practice comes in as well. How in your with your undergraduate paramedicine students who go through at Monash, how do you develop professionalism and communication and all those important and I don't even like soft skills.
Yeah.
We'll get rid of the term.
Yeah, we do.
Those fundamental, foundational skills in communication and professionalism as a younger profession. So it's so paramedicine, for the background for people, paramedicine has, well, why don't you tell everyone the quick background of the profession?
If you've got international listeners too, in Australia, you must have a bachelor degree to be a paramedic. That is not consistent internationally, although it's definitely coming that way. So in Australia, our paramedics are registered health professionals now. That's only happened in the last couple of years. It's probably been about 20 years that they've run through with a bachelor's program, but now it is a requirement. In Australia, you will not get a job as a paramedic unless you have a bachelor's. And we're starting to see that roll out internationally, I suppose. And then the other thing that we're seeing is our clinicians are then going on to do masters and things like that. Some of the clinical skills that our paramedics have are unbelievable. When you look at it on an international scale, we don't have, especially in Victoria, we don't have, all doctors on our helicopters. We have paramedics, and that's because their skill set's so high. But one thing that we do when you talk about our undergraduate students is our first year, before we put them on the back of an ambulance, because we all know that would be very confronting, their placements involve going to childcare centres, going to special education schools, going to aged care facilities. So it's about them learning in a safe environment to communicate with the diverse people who are in our community.
And it's far more well-rounded than just learning skills.
Yep.
And they've got those really impressive, complex, life-saving skills, but those placements are so they can talk to humans from all walks of life.
That's exactly right. I mean, for example, we have placements in special education schools, and if you have someone who is very frightened and intimidated by medical professionals, and then you get called out as a paramedic and you even just want to put a blood pressure cuff on, that's a difficult thing to do if you can't communicate with somebody.
And you probably don't discover that until you go to try it. It doesn't work, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
Which gets us into the territory that some of the territory in an earlier episode I've spoken to Narelle Dalwood about simulation. And you have simulation in the paramedicine course as well. And just until you try to put that blood pressure cuff on and realize you haven't communicated, you won't really know. You assume that everyone understands what you're saying. And
that's right.
So we've got the final thing I wanted to bring up was Ben Meadley. So Ben, so we work together so Ben Meadley's a flight paramedic. I thought I'm going to have him on the podcast in a couple of weeks, and it's a lot of fun because of the nature of what he does. So he's in helicopters, he's winching down into open waters, he's hiking through snow and exciting adventure stuff. But I was lucky enough to co-supervise Ben's PhD with you. So thank you. You and Ben, it was a really good thing to be involved with. So tell us about Ben, just briefly, just as sort of an introduction to him for the next episode.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Ben has an exercise science background before he did paramedicine. So he's always had that interest in health and wellbeing. Obviously, paramedicine took it to a next level to try to help people on that way. He himself, I remember having a meeting with him and he was he wasn't even there. I'm like, what's going on? And he goes, I just smashed myself. I went too hard on my bike ride this morning. So definitely very much into his own sort of health and wellbeing. But I think probably, and I mean, he's not very egotistical, so I can probably say this, probably one of the most skilled clinicians that you would have internationally as a paramedic, like his ability to do things. If you went into an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, he's the person that you want standing next to you from a clinical level, internationally respected, but also wanted to do something in his PhD that he felt could be really useful to a broader group. And, he's very proud of his professional stance as a paramedic and wanted to give back, I suppose, to the profession. And so I think that sort of starting probably did some of the best foundation research we've seen in paramedic health and wellbeing, and really broad, looking at the nutrition, partnered with others. So as much as the sleep stuff wasn't in his thesis, partnered with others with that, looked at the exercise and took that real broad perspective on our really early paramedics in the first year of their job to see how we can make sure they do have a long and fulfilling career.
And so obviously paramedic health is so important, and there's some things that physiotherapists don't have to deal with, like no, that's not necessarily true. There are some long hours, but not that the hard shift work, being on call and being pulled in at 2 a.m. and everything they do. So that aside, what can physiotherapists learn from the work Ben has done and you've done as a part of the paramedic health and wellness research unit that you and Ben have set up at Monash? What can other professions learn from that? You've taken really taken that on as a priority, the well-being of the professional themselves. And look, I'm involved in the first year in helping first-year physio students understand the importance of looking after their own health from our health enhancement program. So there's a similar interest there. But what can we learn from paramedicine in all the work you've done?
Yeah, I think it's really easy if you're a clinician to always put your patient first. And I think that's why people are probably attracted to be a physio or a paramedic, because they have this undying sort of want to help people. And that's fantastic. What we've tried to do, I suppose, with our look is to turn the focus a little bit to the clinician, because, you're not going to be very helpful as a physio if you yourself are injured or fatigued or, all that sort of stuff. So it is about exactly what you say early on, and we do it in our degree training our next level of health professionals to come out to, it's not being selfish to think about yourself. You actually will be a better clinician if you're healthy and you're working well. So taking that time and putting that into your actual overall week or whatever, I think is pretty important. And that's what we've tried to do, and thinking about it from multiple aspects. I mean, physios would know from their training, everything's interlinked, the food, the sleep, your mental health, your physical health, having exercise involved in there. Knowing that it's all a bit individualised, what works for one doesn't work for another. I literally read one of my students' thesis, hopefully she's submitting any day, looking at cardiac rehab, community cardiac rehab. And even that, we have to set things up that work for the individual, and we need to realise that we're all individuals, but don't feel you're being selfish as a clinician for knowing when it's important to take time out for yourself.
It sounds obvious, doesn't it? But it's hard to do.
It's hard
particularly
to do.
in some professions and some roles as well. So important to have a conversation about that.
Yeah. Sounds great. And then we always say that that's the best thing to do. But yeah, as you say, putting it into practice. And I think we do feel like we're being selfish if we take that time out for ourselves. But it's just changing that mindset that you're probably being a bit selfless, because you'll make yourself better if you take the time out.
Again, that's where your life experience comes in. Go and spend some time with people who are genuinely selfish, and you realise that going and looking after your health isn't selfish. It's something that's a part of your job.
Yep, very much so.
All the effort that goes into, and the money that you, and the time that you put into training yourself, and all the resources. And then you want to have a long career.
That's right.
You don't want to be doing it for a couple of years and burning out because you could have taken simple steps to looking after yourself.
Very much so.
So important.
And having those discussions with other clinical partners, don't be scared to speak to the dietitian and sort of say, oh, I haven't been able to do this. And we know paramedics are terrible for it. And I'm sure physios who work in a hospital are the same. You're running crazy. So what do? You go to the vending machine and just get a chocolate bar out because that'll keep you going all afternoon because you haven't had time for lunch. That's not the end of the world. But, if that is your actual stable lunch every day, that's not going to end up well.
Yeah, it's a problem.
So,
yeah. There's so much more I want to talk to you about, but that's it for today because you're a very busy person. And when you want something done, ask the busy person. So I really appreciate you coming on and helping us as a profession, as a physiotherapy profession, just get some insight into the pathway you've taken, but also what paramedicine is doing and what we can learn from that. So do you have any final thoughts or anything else?
Not really. I think this is great to have chats outside. I think we do it with our students at uni. We could probably do it even better with our students at uni, get them to have conversations and start it up. But, the next generations of physios that come through, you'll get to dictate what your profession is by your own sort of stance and behaviour. So, just realise that you guys are the ones who are in control, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a really good thought. And on that one, it would be good to get some students. Well, we've only just started this podcast, but I'm planning to get some students on as well, get their perspectives. But you got to grow the thing. So,
yeah.
And speaking to you, you mentioned Terry Haynes, our head of school. There's another guest I've got on my list. Ben Meadley's coming up soon. And so there's some really interesting people with perspectives that are really important to hear. So thanks, Kelly. I really enjoyed the conversation. So everyone, thanks for joining us as well. If you made it this far, thanks very much for for listening, and make sure you share the episode with someone, like I always say, because, they won't find it. It doesn't really come up. Actually, my name's fairly uncommon and there's not too many Peritons who are physios. So if you search Periton Physio or at Periton Physio, I seem to have number one on Google. So that's really good. So you can find this stuff easily if you're looking for it. Tag me in at Periton Physio or at Luke Periton, Twitter or other social media. And we'll leave it there. So thanks very much, Kelly.
No worries, Luke. Thanks.
So until next time, this is Kelly and Luke wishing you all the very best with your studying, professional development and lifelong learning.